Rare is the day when an X-Men movie is just dumb. I mean, usually, they're actually some of the more smarter-made superhero movies out there because they deal with social commentary on minorities and rights and even the debate between power and compassion. First Class was really good. It had a period piece set during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it made a ton of good character relationships and motivation. Not to mention Days of Future Past, which I think is by far the best X-Men film and probably one of the best superhero movies in general. That movie has a ton of great character drama, some great historical context from the 70s, and even some great action in there as well. It's broad in terms of scope, but it feels smaller because the character relationships are very intimate, and that's great. Well, none of these things I just said are the case with X-Men Apocalypse. This is the first X-Men movie in several years that's just been pretty dumb. Now, don't get me wrong, there is some good in here, and even some great, but there's just not enough of it to counter the bits that feel completely out of place because of how ridiculous or sloppy they are. As has been the case with pretty much all of the superhero movies this year, this film has a lot going on, and while it handles its many plot threads better than BVS did, it still sloppily combines them in a way that's nowhere near as well handled as Civil War was. Characters that were advertised as major players barely get any screen time, and the stuff that they get is pretty shallow. Like, just as an example, the Four Horsemen spare from Magneto have literally no motivation for why they want to serve Apocalypse. Speaking of Apocalypse, the villain in this movie is unbelievably terrible. That's not to say that he's not intimidating, because I guess he is, but his motivation just really doesn't make any sense. While many of the previous X-Men villains represented bigots and racists in complex metaphorical ways, this one just represents the same old thing as every other villain: world domination. That being said, I do think the characters in this movie, for the most part, are its strongest point. We've come to love Charles Xavier and Magneto and Quicksilver and etc., and so the pure love for the characters is really what keeps this movie from plummeting completely. Not to mention the new players like Nightcrawler and Jean Grey and Cyclops, who are all very good in the screen time that they get. Unfortunately, this movie just doesn't know who the main character is. I mean, with these big ensemble cast movies, you kinda have to know who your central person is, and then structure everything else from that. Even with a movie like The Avengers, I'd say Tony Stark is probably the main character, and with Guardians of the Galaxy, it's Peter Quill. And with the X-Men, it should be no different. That's why in every other X-Men movie, they've made Wolverine the main character, and it's worked. I'm not saying I want another Wolverine central movie, I don't, but I just think there needs to be a central character in the movie. I have no idea who the main character in this film is supposed to be. I mean, maybe it's Charles, but honestly, they spend so much time with Jean Grey that it could be her. Or maybe Magneto, to be honest. It's just a lot of stuff and no clear center. The plot of this movie ambles along without a clear point. I mean, usually in a movie there's this thing called crossing the threshold, and it basically means when the characters finally find their goal and start moving toward achieving it. With Days of Future Past, the threshold is crossed when Wolverine is sent back in time, about 10 minutes in. We know exactly what the mission is and what he needs to do. With this, the clear goal isn't really made clear until like 30 minutes before the end of the movie. Before that, it sort of goes from scene to scene without a clear point in mind. If I had to rate X-Men Apocalypse, I'd probably give it a B- or a C+. It's nowhere near as bad as Batman v Superman, but it's still pretty messy storytelling without any real character drama. The action is pretty great. Quicksilver has some good scenes again, but when you don't have a compelling story, none of that really matters anyway. Thanks for watching, guys, and remember to stay in the spirit of cinema.